Welcome to The World This Week, the biggest events of the past 7 days, distilled into 45 minutes alongside 4 distinguished correspondents in their field. In a week that's seen the US indict the 94-year-old former Cuban president, Raúl Castro, charged with murder and conspiracy to kill US nationals relating to events 30 years ago when Cuban forces shot down 2 unarmed civilian aircraft. The Trump administration says it's finally delivering justice. Analysts frame it as a broader escalating campaign for regime change, Venezuela 2.0. We'll assess the implications.
Not only Cuban Americans, but people that came from Cuba that want to go back to Cuba, people that want to see their family in Cuba. I think this is a very big day, very important day.
It's been a week that's seen China not so much roll out as copy and paste the red carpet welcome ceremony for a few days ago, swapping the Trump greeting US flags with Russian ones as President Putin went to Beijing on a rare overseas visit to, quote, compare notes with President Xi post-Trump visit. No tour of the Temple of Heaven for Putin, but there was a replay of tea with Xi sipping from gold-plated cups the leaders boasted of unyielding relations. Meanwhile, Ukraine was also making headlines for deep strike drone operations taking place in the Russian heartlands.
The world today is far from peaceful. Unilateralism and hegemony pose grave danger. And the world faces the risk of regressing to the law of the jungle.
It's been a week that's seen the World Health Organization declare a public health emergency after the rapid spread of Ebola in Central Africa. More than 130 people have died in the DRC, and although it hasn't yet been categorized as a pandemic, there are fears the situation could flare in the east with ongoing armed conflict and containment rules contrasting with cultural traditions. On Thursday, a treatment facility was set on fire by locals after health officials prevented a family retrieving the body of a man suspected to have died from Ebola.
We must understand that the disease exists and is real. It is dangerous because it has neither vaccine nor medicine.
It's also been a week that's seen Air France and Airbus found guilty of manslaughter over a plane crash in 2009, which killed 228 people. A week of widespread condemnations over Israel's treatment of activists arrested on an aid flotilla. And a week where Elon Musk lost his case against Sam Altman in the court case, the battle of the billionaires. And also where Eurovision's Bulgaria's Bangaranga gave the country its first ever win. Let's meet a brilliant bangaranging panel tonight. In the studio with me is Victor Mallet, Senior Editor for the Financial Times. Good evening, Victor. Author of several acclaimed books, The Trouble with Tigers, The Rise and Fall of Southeast Asia. Also River of Life, River of Death, The Ganges and India's Future. And Victor's latest as well is a must-read to understand the months ahead on the French election calendar. It is Far-Right France, Le Pen, Bardella and the Future of Europe. Let me ask you, Victor, you've been on a US tour with the book. What kind of questions have you been getting?
I think the most common question is the obvious one, which is, is the far right going to win the next election? And the next question is, will it be Jordan Bardella or Marine Le Pen who's the candidate for the Rassemblement National? Those are the 2 main questions. But then, of course, there are all the implications.
And what do you say?
People ask me to put a number on it, and I say 60%, but of course no one knows because accidents happen in
60% that it's Bardella?
Yes, probably, yes. If against any comers, I think, pretty much at this stage.
When will we know?
Well, we'll know on the day in spring of 2027, I think is the... But, the one...
We're waiting for this Court of Appeal decision, aren't we, for Marine Le Pen?
Yeah, that's when we know whether it will be her or him. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Victor, it's always good having you on board and your analysis as well. Let's switch over sides. Let's bring in Constant Mode from the New York Times. Great to have you back with us as well,
Great to be here.
Usually based in Kyiv, part of the New York Times team that won the most acclaimed prize in American journalism, the Hillman Prize for Newspaper Journalism in 2023 for Ransom, the Root of Haiti's Misery. It is brilliant to have you. And let me ask you something about covering the conflict right now. In the midst of Iran getting so much bandwidth from the Americans, has it changed the rhythm that you've been working?
It has, for sure. We're publishing less stories, but I'd say that sometimes, there's an advantage to it because you can spend more time reporting your stories. So just to give you an example, I spent 10 days on the front. I just came back from Ukraine a couple of days ago. This is something that we rarely have the opportunity to do because we have to also file stories from Kyiv about the news. So it's been pretty great, I thought.
Tell me where you went to. You went to the Zaporizhzhia.
I went to the Zaporizhzhia region. This is the southern part of the front line. This is really important for us to go to the front pretty regularly because this is a war that's changing every 3 to 6 months because of the technologies, because of the drones. So say like a year ago, I was in the eastern part of the front near the city of Konstantinivka, which is today pretty much embattled. And at the time, the use of ground drones, those robots on wheels, was pretty rare. Some units were using it, but people didn't really pay attention to it. This time, ground drones are just everywhere, and this is the thing that the units are using all the time to resupply their troops at the front. So just in a matter of 9 months, basically, those ground robots have become one of the main tools that the units use to resupply their troops, and that's quite fascinating.
It is fascinating because it was kind of making headline news when we see this odd occasional rescue operation. We even saw the older lady, the babushka, with a sign saying "Get in, Granny," and we saw her being wheeled away. But now it's becoming ubiquitous. Great to have you with us as well tonight, Constant. Let's move across the channel to London. Let's bring in another friend of the programme, Francis Dearnley, executive editor of Audio, The Telegraph, and co-host of the fantastic podcast Ukraine, the Latest, with Dom Nichols. Great to have you back. Welcome back to The World This Week, Francis.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You have had a very interesting month so far covering pro-UK protests at the Venice Biennale Arts Festival. And tell us about this, debating against the former Slovak Prime Minister on the merits of going to war with Russia rather than losing Ukraine.
Yes, it was a very interesting debate hosted at the Oxford Union, which I was very kindly by them invited to speak for the proposition. The proposition being put forward was that this House would rather go to war with Russia than lose Ukraine. Now, of course, that's extremely provocative in many respects, but I think what this really speaks to is how significant Ukraine has become, how integral it is for European defence now, particularly given the evolving American position. And we've seen, of course, Marco Rubio only today with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte basically talking again about the need to reduce troops and the scepticism that the United States now has towards the NATO alliance. And so I'm very pleased to say that we won that debate in terms of persuading students and those present as to the importance that Ukraine now has in the European security architecture.
Francis, as always, really looking forward to hearing your analysis as well tonight. Thank you. Let's complete the lineup. Let's head to New York. We had a brief glimpse of Hermania a moment ago. Let's welcome her back, the American-Venezuelan journalist, commentator, Hermania Rodriguez-Pelayo, former US chief reporter for the Daily Mail, who has her own platform, YouTube, Instagram, and a strong following on social media under I Am Hermania. Great to see you again. Tell us about your week and what you've been focusing on.
Well, I actually spent some time in Miami this week where the Cuban American community got some really good news. It's news that they have been waiting decades for, and they are now seeing a glimpse of justice of this tragedy that happened in 1996, just one of many tragedies that the Cuban people have lived through. So certainly, finally, the Latin American topic is having attention and movement over here, and we are very happy about it.
We will discuss exactly what's going on with whether it's a Venezuela 2.0 or not. And briefly, Hermania, I know, love him or hate him, President Trump has made you laugh this week. He was asked whether he was going to go to his son's wedding. This is what he said.
I said, this is not good timing for me. I have a thing called Iran and other things. That's one I can't win on. If I do attend, I get killed. If I don't attend, I get killed. By the fake news, of course, I'm talking about. No, but he's got a very person who I've known for a long time, and hopefully they're going to have a great marriage.
He's a person he's known for a very long time, Hermania, a.k.a. your own son.
And he's really good at populism, and I have been very critical of President Trump, but unfortunately, he's still very funny, and this is how he has been able to connect to as many people as he has. It's showbiz, baby.
It's going to be great to have your insights as well tonight, both on Cuba and Venezuela. Right, let's get started. And we begin on 11 o'clock in the morning, Beijing, Wednesday. President Putin's first foreign visit of the year, the 25th trip to China in 26 as leader. After the honour guard, the smiling, waving spectators, the salutes of Chinese children, President Putin and Xi made their opening remarks inside the Great Hall of the People in honour of his counterpart. Russia's leader quoted classic Chinese poetry from the Book of Songs.
Прибить китайскую поговорку, насколько нам известно, в Китае говорят, не виделись день, а как будто минуло 3 осени. Действительно, рада очень вас видеть.
Usually inscrutable ex-KGB officer with words of prose. Now, Beijing is not a member of the International Criminal Court. It didn't ratify the Rome Statute, meaning it's not one of the 125 members obligated to detain Putin on behalf of the ICC for alleged war crimes in Ukraine. China is described by NATO as a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine based on its continued economic and industrial support to Moscow. And President Trump has been more nuanced in his framing, and Beijing says it's a neutral actor, which takes us to tea with Xi and Putin. Moscow were hoping for seemingly warm and unyielding friendship would lead to a gas pipeline deal being agreed from Siberia to Mongolia to replace its lost income from Europe. Long coveted, China appeared to play it cool. Analysts say Beijing knows Russia's desperate and it's using the leverage to demand low prices. So no deal as Putin departed. They did sign a joint statement, a declaration that read as follows: the relations are the best in history. They offer stability in a world that's turbulent and support a, quote, multipolar world order. Regarding Iran, it said they call for return to negotiations. President Trump's policy was criticised, his so-called Golden Dome missile defence system, saying it undermines global strategic stability. And also on Ukraine, the two parties are, quote, convinced of the need to completely eliminate the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. While Ukraine this week was still taking significant blows from daily bombardments, it's been making headlines for their own strike back. Victor, let's start with you. How would you sum up the Xi-Putin visit, compare and contrast to the Xi-Trump visit?
Well, I think it's really interesting to think back to the first Gulf War in 1990-91, when the Russians and the Chinese did not veto the UN Security Council resolution that authorized the Americans and their allies to go in to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And they looked on as the war proceeded in amazement at the kind of new technology that the Americans were deploying, precision laser-guided bombs and that kind of thing. And they were like, wow, this is a real change in warfare. And I think, as Constant was saying, we're seeing a similar thing now in the Ukraine-Russia war. And I think that's the most sort of significant thing. It's just a complete change in the way wars are conducted. And I think the Chinese and the Russians must be looking at the Ukraine-Russia conflict and saying, bloody hell. And so would every other military commander. Because it's not just, you were talking about the land drones, but also, of course, we all think we know about air drones, but there are sea drones, there are submarine drones. I mean, the nature of warfare has just completely changed in this war. And of course, during warfare, you get this very accelerated technological development, which the Ukrainians are on top of, but the Russians are also accelerating their development of deploying different kinds of drones and countermeasures. And you just have this absolute transformation of warfare. And I'm sure that the Chinese are sitting there and thinking, we really have to pay attention to this. And the Russians, of course, are doing the same because they're in that war. And I just think Trump and the Americans seem to be a bit out of it. They're still thinking old thoughts about the importance. I mean, Trump's thinking about battleships and tanks. I mean, these things are just not relevant anymore in modern warfare. And I just think this is the kind of most significant change that we've seen from that.
I think you've hit something, Francis. It's worth saying that analysts and seasoned China watchers have said that they are watching Russia's drone capabilities, the battlefield technologies. That's a great interest to China's military. And to Victor's point as well, the transformational level, not just drones as talk on Russian telegram sites of so-called Martian drones. These Ukrainian drones said to coordinate with AI. They become something of a mythical fear machine in itself. But is it akin to, the industrial changes that we saw with the tank back in the days of World War One?
Well, I think we are certainly seeing a new era of warfare, as has just been very eloquently articulated. And many countries, not just the Chinese, the Americans, certainly the Europeans, are watching very closely what is happening in Ukraine and the horror that is unfolding there and taking the lessons from it. In terms of those lessons specifically, I think it is very important to underscore something relating to Beijing, which is that they describe themselves as neutral. But the fact is that we've learned just this week from an exclusive in Reuters that they trained several hundreds of special forces that were deployed in Ukraine for the Russians. We know that they, of course, have been financially supporting the Russians for a sustained period of time, but also as well, there is a lot of reporting, including in our own paper, as to the support in terms of drone components in an attempt to circumnavigate the Western sanctions. So Beijing is not a neutral arbiter in this. And one of the reasons, as you say, for that is because they have a lot to lose. By not having the intelligence and not learning the lessons that the Russians are learning in the bloodiest way from this war. I mean, I think it's very important to a point that you raised at the very beginning that to underscore here that yes, Iran has taken the headlines, but actually this is an immensely bloody phase of the war. This is not static by any means. Ukraine has made more gains in the last few months, more gains than Russia has, certainly, and the casualty numbers are still staggering. Zelensky today said 146,000 Russians have been lost, of which 85,000 have been killed by their metrics. And that is using, as you say, AI and data that is a system called Delta, where they can take this information and actually accurately predict where the battle is going. And that is one of the other things that is being taken from this. And the worst raid of the war, as far as Kyiv is concerned, in terms of numbers and missiles fired upon their cities, was not in the first month of the war, it was last month. And I think it is very important to underscore that.
I'm trying to work it out. I don't know if it is known yet, but there's just two things that buzz around in my head. One is Alex Karp of Palantir, this incredible data analysis organisation that is coveted around the world and causes fear around the world as well. Was in Ukraine, Francis, and I wonder whether we're seeing a connection between Palantir and the ability of AI to work with drones, or just simply the ability of drones themselves in Ukraine reaching further and more accurately.
Oh, it's definitely much more than just the accuracy of the drones and the technology. This is AI being used in a way that is totally pioneering, hence why they've been very keen to be involved and indeed are involved in projects in Ukraine. But Ukraine has also developed its own technology. I referenced Delta, which in essence is an operating system that receives information from what the drones are receiving in terms of their camera, but then is able to make predictions about forces. It looks at satellite imagery, it looks at troop deployments. This is unprecedented, and it means that sometimes operations that are being conducted are happening many dozens of miles away from the actions themselves, but the people controlling that in terms of the drones and the orders are in a sense right there on the front line. And that, of course, has not happened before really in the history of warfare, not to that degree, not that granularly, where somebody can be pointing at a certain sector of the front and say, can you use that drone to take out that individual from hundreds of miles away on the scale that we've seen. Of course, we've seen this in the Middle East with drones that were killing commanders in Afghanistan particularly, but this is happening hundreds of times a day across various different levels of the front, and AI is playing a crucial role in that.
It is. There is a name that keeps coming up as well, Constant. This is Major Robert Brovdi, known by his call sign Magyar, or Hungarian, that he's taken control of the head of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces. I think it's something like 2%, isn't it, of the overall military, but it's showing, as Francis said, this kind of great strength despite Ukraine's manpower disadvantage. Are you seeing that reflected in the confidence of troops in Zaporizhia? Are they feeling buoyed by this?
I'd say yes. Look, today about 80% of the casualties are caused by drones. So somebody like Magyar, Robert Brovdi, who's the head of the drone forces, is crucial for Ukraine when it comes to countering the Russian threat. Now, he is a very interesting guy, very interesting profile. He's kind of a star right now in Ukraine because he brought to the Ukrainian army this almost scientific, mathematical approach to war, which is how many drones do we need to make sure that we can cause more casualties to the Russian army than the number of people they can recruit Today, that's their goal, essentially. They are claiming, and we should take that claim with a grain of salt, that they are causing about 35,000 casualties a month at the moment, which is more than what Russia can recruit. They're also targeting tanks. They're also targeting all sorts of equipment, artillery. All of this is basically making sure that they stop the Russians before they can even advance on the battlefield. So when you go to the front these days, essentially you have several sort of layers of positions. On the contact line, you have the troops. Those are the people who are directly engaging with the Russian soldiers, or even sometimes just basically radioing their coordinates to their drone teams behind them, because it's way safer to tell the drone teams, some soldiers are getting in, are infiltrating our positions. Can you bring in a drone and target them? Than actually engaging in a firefight with them. Then behind them, you have the drone teams that I've just described. And even behind them, as was just mentioned, you have the long-range drone teams, sometimes operating 50, 60, 70 kilometers away from the contact line, because they're targeting the logistics, the roads, the artillery, all the fuel depot, all that basically forms the backbone of the Russian army. So it's created this new type of, we're talking about the new nature of warfare, but this is also a new type of battlefield. If you go to Ukraine, or and you'll hear that as well from the Russian army, today the new sort of buzzword is the kill zone. The kill zone is essentially this new model of the no man's land. We've all heard of the no man's land from World War I. It was about 500 meters between two contact lines. Today, this is from 5 to 15 kilometers, and this is the zone where anything that moves gets immediately picked up by a reconnaissance drone and then targeted by several drones, sometimes up to 15 drones, until you make sure that the soldier or the piece of equipment gets destroyed or killed.
To that point, Francis, you talked about this constant moving line. This is not a static warfare. You've looked at something this week which is about Russia changing its tactics, the so-called meat grinder operations.
Yes, so we, of course, have been reporting now for extensive periods of time the meat wave assaults. It's a horrible term for what is the reality, which is Russia, because it has mass, has been just sending thousands and thousands of men into frontline positions, knowing that the chances of them being killed is very high, but doing so because they hope by using numbers that eventually they can break through. But actually, as the battlefield has evolved, we've seen a shifting of tactics in the last few months, and it particularly picked up at the beginning of this year, which is effectively Russia trying to use small men units, usually like 4 or 5, to infiltrate the rather porous lines that we see in certain sectors of the front. And then once infiltrated, they essentially try to move behind positions, mean that they can fire at various different angles, and then they send another wave in. Now, this sounds sort of rather counterintuitive in the sense that you don't think that this could be successful, but it is important to underscore that, but given how massive Ukraine is, it is Europe's largest country, not every aspect of the line is defended with the same level of intensity as one might expect, imagining the First World War. And so as a consequence of that, there are these areas where the line is more porous, and so people hope to be able to make more progress with these small man units. But what's a problem for journalists and for military analysts is that people think, well, if we're hearing reports of there being some troops there, it must mean that there's some kind of breakthrough further along the line. But actually, just because 4 men make some sort of progress a few dozen miles behind the line does not mean that they have consolidated that gain. And there was a lot of excited reporting last year about the Russians making this huge 50-kilometer piercing movement into Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine was managed to very quickly mop that up because really all that happened was a few forces had managed to infiltrate deeper into Ukraine with these small man teams, sometimes using motorbikes and buggies, and then had made that little bit of progress, but it does not mean a decisive breakthrough. And we have not seen masses of success from this new tactic that Russia has adopted. But clearly they are innovating, and that is important to underscore here. Ukraine is innovating, but Russia is too. And it is a very, very fast changing war, as has been already described.
Constant.
Just to add to what Francis just said, one of the reasons why they're actually sending those small groups is because today the front line is constantly is monitored by the drones. So if you come in with a big group of soldiers, say 100 soldiers, they'll be immediately picked up by drones, and this will make for a very, very easy target for the Ukrainians or the Russians. So that's why if you send only 2 soldiers walking through a tree line, it'll be way easier to conceal yourself from the drones than with a big, say, armored vehicle and as part of a big armored assault. Second point is about what Francis just said about, you have those infiltrations and you never really know who controls what. This is what today is called the gray zone. That is this area where nobody essentially controls the territory because all of those positions overlap. And it doesn't mean that anybody, because you have a Ukrainian or a Russian soldier in a building, doesn't mean that they control it. They're actually just trying to defend it and waiting to get more soldiers in order to consolidate their positions and clear out the enemy positions.
From Beijing to the battlefield, back to Beijing for a moment to see what came of this summit, as we talked about right at the top. It is fascinating just to hear about the battlefield and the drone warfare. But in the diplomacy, Hermania, what are you making of this, the alpha leader power play going on? We had this poetic Putin, but we have ultimately the Statesman of the Month award right now is President Xi, isn't he? He's sitting pretty with leaders coming to him.
Yeah, and this is all connected, even with what's going on in the Western Hemisphere. As you said, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party are in a sweet spot right now, but we know who they align with at the end of the day, and that's why in his meeting with Putin, they kind of spoke against the war in the Middle East, but they don't have similar language for the war in Ukraine. So we know that they are quite different cultures and situation, but they have something in common, is that they want a world where the U.S. is not the only superpower. They want a world where Western values are not the ones that have the most strength and power geopolitically, and that's where Xi Jinping and Putin are together. However, we also had some reporting, I believe, from the Financial Times saying that Xi Jinping has been saying to Trump also that he believes that Putin will come to regret this invasion, and all of those who want to live in a world where Western democratic values are the strongest ones. We hope certainly that that's what ends up happening here.
Very interesting. Victor, let me just pick you up on a brief point to Hermania's point, which is kind of the diplomatic bandwidth around Xi, around Trump, around Putin. But meanwhile, Zelensky has been on manoeuvres in the Gulf. And I just wonder whether we're seeing him selling drone technology, that Ukraine is reshaping its strategic position.
Yes, and I think he's been to other parts of the world as well. He's clearly doing that. And the great card that he has that Trump initially dismissed as pointless, but obviously wasn't, is the drone technology, and he's been, selling that to the Gulf states, and the expertise that he has. He's clearly leveraging that in a very effective way to say that we are not just a sort of a US ally or whatever. We're not just somebody. We're an independent country, and we have technology that you want. And he's been doing the same with Western countries as well, which also realize, as we've been discussing, the changing nature of warfare, and they have a lot to learn from the Ukrainians, which not only does Ukraine have and is developing all the time this new technology that is become the new form of warfare, but they also have more men under arms than any country in Western Europe. So they are, doing what they need to do. Yeah.
Just as we're on air, Victor, we're hearing from the US intelligence chief in the past 30 seconds or so, Tulsi Gabbard, saying she's resigned as of this evening, ending her tenure as it's fair to say, contrarian who appeared to be at odds with President Trump over the Iran war. She said in a letter it's over her husband's illness. An interesting point to take us to Wednesday, Cuban Independence Day, where breaking news came from Freedom Tower, Miami, landmark site, once the processing centre of hundreds of thousands of Cuban exiles who'd fled after the revolution. It was 1 o'clock when federal prosecutors gathered on stage with the Deputy Director of the FBI and the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, to tell the crowd that one of the most symbolically important surviving figures of the revolution and the regime ever since Raúl Castro is now a wanted fugitive.
Today, we are announcing an indictment charging Raúl Castro and several others with conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals.
Raúl Castro, the 94-year-old former president, brother of the late Fidel Castro, charged in connection with the shooting down of 2 civilian planes, killing 4 people, 3 of them American citizens, in 1996. Raúl Castro was Armed Forces Minister at the time. Those killed were part of an exile group, Brothers to the Rescue, that flew planes over the Florida Straits to help spot and help as well the Cuban rafters fleeing the island, and who also flew anti-Castro protest flights, dropping leaflets against the regime. There's already a US energy blockade on the island, which has meant almost no fuel has reached Cuba since January. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, son of Cuban immigrants, was speaking separately on Cuban Independence Day in Spanish, claiming that the Cuban military-owned conglomerate, Gaesa, is hoarding billions from ordinary Cubans so that the elite can live in luxury, while he said the ordinary people are forced to eat from garbage. He said President Trump was offering a new path.
Una nueva Cuba, donde ustedes, y no solo el Partido Comunista de Cuba, pueda ser dueño de una estación de televisión o de un periódico. Una nueva Cuba, donde pueda quejarse de un sistema que falla, sin temor a ir a la cárcel o ser forzado a irse de su isla.
What happens next? Hermania, should we look to events in Venezuela to shape what could come next in Cuba?
Perhaps. That's where the question lies, and there are several things at play here. This indictment of Raúl Castro, first of all, it's something that's long overdue. The U.S. government has had recordings of him ordering his army to shoot down these planes, even though they weren't in Cuban airspace. That's on one side of it. Now, will this indictment lead to what the real objective is, which is regime change? Well, regime change has not happened in Venezuela yet. We've had a lot of good changes, and we are seeing hope, but it's not that easy, and it's going to be even harder in Cuba, where ideology, actual communist ideology, plays more of a role. Also, Raúl Castro is way more protected in bunkers and such, is the information we have, than Maduro was. And another aspect of this is, let's say they try to do an operation like they did in Venezuela, and they simply remove Raúl Castro if they manage to do that. Well, as we have learned in Venezuela, that is not enough to completely change the system in Cuba. It's nearly 70 years of this entrenched, brutal communism for the people, because as we know, the ruling party, they do have billions of dollars stashed away. And another question here is, the United States had Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela to take over. There's not an obvious Delcy-like figure in Cuba that could take over. We have seen options, rumors about who it would be. One of Raúl Castro's grandsons, they called him Raulito. He has been coming out and clearly lobbying himself as a pro-capitalism person. So will they try to make Raulito the Cuban Delcy? These are the questions up in the air, but it's not going to be as easy as it was in Venezuela.
Very interesting. Raulito, there's 2 things I'd like you to try and connect together, if you will, and provide some context on, Hermania. One, you've got President Trump earlier this week kind of ruling out the escalation, he said. He said he doesn't need it because, quote, the regime is falling apart. Make of that what you will. Secondly, right at the start of the week, we had Axios reporting, quoting government officials saying that Cuba's regime, goes back to the drone question, they've acquired 300 military drones, and they've discussed possible attack situations on Guantanamo Bay, the US naval base on the island, primarily sourced these drones from Russia and Iran. Is it plausible, and is it plausible this could be also a CIA psychological ops, which offers a story to justify policy and what could come next?
Listen, I really respect Mark Caputo and his reporting. I know he has been accused of falling for a CIA psyop. However, if you know the nature of these regimes, I come from a similar one. Actually, the dictatorship in my country comes from Cuba. For those who say that Cuba has never done anything to anyone, well, the disaster in Venezuela and in Nicaragua comes from Cuba. Now, to your first question on Trump's comments and what he hopes, I think President Trump does not understand the nature of the Cuban dictatorship still. And I think he is hoping that this pressure of this indictment on Raúl Castro, just like the energy blockade, is going to get this communist dictatorship to sit down to the table and do whatever Trump says. It didn't work out that way in Venezuela. Things did not change in Venezuela until there was a use of force. And in Cuba, it will be similarly. They are not going to bow down to this pressure that they have already been surviving for 70 years.
What's your take on the situation, Victor?
I think it's. I mean, obviously, Cuba looks to Trump like an easy option, but I think what the Americans and Trump in particular seem to forget is that other people in conflicts have, their own views, their own agency as to what they might do. And clearly, he didn't think about this with Iran. Iran responded in ways that were fairly predictable to most of the world, but were a complete surprise to Trump. Probably not a surprise to some of his advisors who obviously didn't listen to. But the same could happen in Cuba. I mean, they were very lucky in Venezuela, the Americans. You could have easily had a situation where some of those special forces people could have been killed. The mission might have been a failure. You think back to Jimmy Carter's attempt to rescue the U.S. hostages in Iran. I mean, these missions don't always go according to plan, and he was very lucky that there wasn't the Venezuelans were obviously not sufficiently prepared for this attack, or at least maybe they were primed to sort of let it all happen. But the same is unlikely to happen in Cuba. And I think you just got to remember, and regardless of whether that, how strong that story is about drones being used to attack Guantanamo Bay, clearly the Cubans will have a response in mind that is not something that Trump seems to think about, that the other side is going to respond in a way that he can't predict.
Exactly.
It's a very, Hermione, I'll just come in because it's worth saying that maybe the Iran situation that Trump didn't predict, and he said as much, was the Strait of Hormuz.
Correct. And I think President Trump is having an issue. He got a little bit too excited with Venezuela. And I think I was on your show before Maduro's arrest, and people were saying, Venezuela is going to be another Iraq, another Libya. And we Venezuelans said, no, the situation is completely different because we don't have all these layered conflicts. The same could not be said from Iran. So to think that something that worked out in Venezuela could be duplicated in Iran or even in Cuba is just simply not the case. The situations are completely different, and not because the citizens in all these three countries, the large majority of them, want to be free and live under Western values. That is not the issue. The issue is that the few who control the violence and the power and the money are not going to easily give up without fighting back and trying to make their ideology survive. And in both Cuba and Iran, the ideological issue is way stronger than in Venezuela.
Which takes us to the point, maybe you can help explain context, because there are similarities with Venezuela here and with Cuba, which is Marco Rubio, who we saw. He appeared emotional in this speech. He went into detail about this organisation, GAESA, this state-controlled economic structure which enriches a ruling elite. He said, well, ordinary people suffer. That this is ultimately not necessarily Raúl Castro, but this is at the heart of Cuban suffering that is going to be much more difficult to go.
Well, of course, I seen Secretary Marco Rubio. You have to understand, for those of us victims of left-wing dictatorships that come from Cuba, to see someone like Marco Rubio express what he did and understand our cause, which is the same one, as well as he does, especially because our countries have been ignored for decades and decades. Raúl Castro should have been indicted for the murder of this activist, Hermanos al Rescate, decades ago. But our Western Hemisphere has been ignored for far too long. I always tell Europeans, you guys understand why you should care about Ukraine. Well, Cuba is 90 miles from Miami. It's even closer, and it has caused a lot of damage in our hemisphere. I would not be speaking to you right now in English if it wasn't for the Cuban dictatorship. So it's time to address it and to stop the suffering of the Cuban people. It's not about stopping sanctions or the embargo. That is not to blame. What's to blame is the brutal system that doesn't even let Cubans go out to fish on their own to feed themselves. What's to blame is the $18 billion that the Cuban leadership is stashing away.
Constant, what's your reading of what's going on?
Well, I mean, I agree with the fact that it does seem that President Trump was very excited after the Venezuelan operation, and now that Iran happened, and then that he's been essentially stuck with the Iran war, he's got to be way more careful with Cuba. Now, one thing that struck me is how, the story from Axios, the use of drones. This is really interesting because in Ukraine today, you have a lot of foreign fighters fighting within the Ukrainian army. Most of them, in fact, come from Latin America. I don't exactly know whether Cuban fighters are fighting within the Ukrainian army. I know for a fact that a lot of Colombian fighters are in a lot of different units. Those people will ultimately go back to Latin America with skills such as being drone operators that can be of use in those different countries. So we should also expect, and we've seen that already happening in countries such as Africa, where some drone operations have been already in action. We should expect to see that sort of fighting also reaching Latin America and at some point maybe Northern America.
Yeah, this kind of rapid wave of transformational change, as Victor pointed out right at the top. Let's move to Cannes. There has been an uproar this week in the French film industry. The festival is finishing up. The headlines of furore with Bolloré, Vincent Bolloré, who's a right-wing billionaire tycoon, the owner of Canal+, and with it Studio Canal, which is Europe's largest film production company. On Sunday at the Promenade de la Croisette, as industry executives were halfway through seafood buffet brunch, had pastries, champagne, organised by Canal+, their CEO, Maxime Saada, dropped a bombshell. He said the company would no longer work with more than 600 actors, actresses, professionals in French cinema, Juliette Binoche being among the signatories, because he said they crossed a line. They signed a petition titled Switch Off Bolloré, criticising Mr. Bolloré, warning about his growing control, calling for mobilisation against what they claimed was his attempt to lead a far-right, quote, civilisational project through French media. Now, Victor, this is timely for you, having released Far-Right France, Chapter 11, being France's Fox News and the battle for public opinion within it. You touch on the so-called Bollorisation of French media. Set out some context for us.
Yeah, I think clearly, Bolloré is the kind of prime far-right media mogul in France at the moment. He's bought Journal du Dimanche. He's got control of CNews. So he has all this stuff, a bit like Murdoch in the US with Fox News and the right-wing press in Britain and so on. But it's a very sort of weird situation we find ourselves in, where in a way I think both sides have been a bit stupid in this dispute, because the actors and the cinema people who were complaining are not complaining about something that's actually happened. In fact, at the moment, Canal+, has continued to finance films that are quite left-wing and quite anti-fascist and quite liberal, as well as every other film. I mean, they are the dominant sort of financier of films in France today. So what people were talking about was if I can quote, in their sort of editorial that they all joined their signatures to, was there's a risk of a fascist taking of control of the collective imagination, is what they said in French. I mean, it is a risk, obviously, but it hasn't actually happened. So you then had, in a way, it's a bit of an overreaction to take that position, because it obviously exposes you to retaliation from Bolloré's empire, which is what's happened. But Bolloré's reaction, or Maxime Saada's reaction, was also a bit over the top, because he's now sort of, if you like, confirming that he is, deplatforming people of the left because they signed this thing. So in a way, both sides, have overstepped the mark in terms of diplomacy and for their own interests. It's not clear where this is going. And there was an editorial in Le Monde basically taking that position and saying, look, this is mad for everybody, because it's not going to help anybody. But you can understand why the kind of left liberal people in cinema, which are akin to the left liberal people in Hollywood, are sort of worried about the future. But whether this was the right way to go about dealing with the risk of what might happen in the future is very questionable, I think.
But it's worth, and you can help us here, just taking us back from the immediacy, because historically, as you look at in the French far right, going back to the days of Jean-Marie Le Pen, complaining that whilst the government promoted pluralism and the shock of ideas, as you call it, the party were boycotted by state TV.
That is true, and there is still probably a kind of left liberal consensus in the kind of the state media of France, and indeed the establishment in general, academia. And this is something that the far right has complained about for a long time. Now, it is actually being that sort of freezing out of the far right is being reduced because of the extreme, the prominence of the far right. They are now the biggest party in the French parliament. So they are now getting interviews all the time on all kinds of television stations. But that wasn't the case when the party was young and when Jean-Marie Le Pen was in the ascendant, as it were. So at that time, those complaints about being frozen out by the leftist media, if you like, were justified. And in fact, Jean-Marie Le Pen, complained directly to François Mitterrand, the socialist president, and said, this is not good enough, and Mitterrand ordered the state broadcaster to basically interview him on air, which they did. So, but the situation has really moved on now, because the Rassemblement National is such an important force in French politics, they can no longer be frozen out. But, there is still that sort of residual kind of dislike in the French traditional media of the far right, and that continues. And then you have the insurgent far right media, which is mainly financed and owned by Vincent Bolloré that you've been talking about. So you have a sort of very fluid situation, and you obviously we had just before this Cannes disaster, if you like, we had the issue of Grasset, the publisher, where he fired the boss of Olivier Noir, the boss of Grasset, which is a publisher, eminent French publisher.
Hachette goes back to the days of Proust.
And then 100 authors said they were leaving, they would never have their books published, and then Bolloré then reacted and said, well, I don't care about them, and then another 100 authors joined the kind of exodus. So, and the same thing happened with this when Maxime Saada said this about the cinema, the filmmakers and the actors. They all, more joined the kind of complaint against Bolloré. So, yeah.
Time is not on our side at the moment. It is fascinating to hear that, and also this is going to continue to play out. The bosses of Canal Plus have said this: the criticism is an injustice towards Canal Plus staff. It contributes to French cinema. Its editorial and cultural choices are not dictated, they say, by ideology. And that's all we have time for. Thank you to my brilliant panel tonight. So Victor Mallet, senior editor for the Financial Times, acclaimed author of books The Trouble with Tigers, The Rise and Fall of Southeast Asia, River of Life, River of Death, The Ganges and India's Future, and, as we heard, far-right France, Le Pen, Bardella, The Future of Europe. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
Thank you to Constant Mode from the New York Times. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you in New York to Hermania Rodriguez-Paleo, the former US chief reporter for the Daily Mail. You'll find her platforms under I Am Hermania. Thank you so much, Hermania. And in London. Thank you, Francis Durnley, executive editor of audio at Telegraph, co-host of the brilliant podcast Ukraine, The Latest, with Dom Nichol. I highly recommend it. Thank you, Francis. Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
Now, the prestigious Palme d'Or will be announced this weekend. We'll leave you this week with a film that is not in the running, but it's been eagerly anticipated, released tonight in cinemas worldwide. A tale of a mercenary doing the bidding of a shadowy, powerful organisation without asking too many questions, whose moral awakening comes when he refuses an order. He starts making independent, ethical judgments about who deserves to be hunted. Make of that what you will. It's not a documentary, not yet. Anyway, it is the latest Star Wars spin-off, Mandalorian and the Grogu. Thank you for watching For the World next week in 7 days. See you, we will.
Hey, never touch the buttons. Let's save the rest for after dinner.